Colón. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guests are Eric LeCompte, Executive Director of Jubilee USA, and labor activist Jose La Luz, joining us in New York. Juan?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Jose, also taking over from what Eric LeCompte just said, that this whole issue of the chaos that would have resulted, supposedly, if this bill had not been passed. Maria Cantwell, in her debate, in her remarks on the Senate floor, as well as Bob Menendez, said, number one is you're deluding yourself if you think there's not going to be legal challenges. The bondholders and the vulture funds are not just going to sit back. They're going to challenge the constitutionality of this law. And there seem to be significant grounds. For instance, the Congressional Budget Office report even questions what kind of an agency this is. The legislation says it is created by Congress as an agency of the Puerto Rican government. The Congressional Budget Office says no, this is an agency of the federal government, not of the Puerto Rican government. There's a host of issues that the bondholders are going to challenge anyway. The only difference is at this stage, as Eric, you mentioned that the governor has put a moratorium on the debt and will not be able to make regular expenses of the Puerto Rican government. But as soon as the control board comes into power, he's not going to have any more power. The control board will determine everything. So this could be virtually the last act of the current governor of Puerto Rico, this moratorium that he did today. So I wanted to ask Jose, what about this whole issue of this law had to be passed before July 1, or there would be chaos in Puerto Rico?
As recently as last night, the president of the Senate, Eduardo Batia, indicated that there will be, in fact, litigation occurring, precisely because of the very reasons you pointed out to. Senator Orrin Hatch has requested an investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission about the role of Treasury Secretary Liu. There are many questions that are unanswered here. A Citizens Inquiry Commission discovering its findings that as much as $30 billion of the debt may be illegal because it exceeded the ceiling provided by the Constitution of the Commonwealth. So there are many, many questions, but one of the fundamental things here is that there is no guarantee that, in fact, there will be restructuring. It requires a supermajority of 5, and 4 of the 7 will, in fact, be right-wing Republicans, whose main interest undoubtedly would be that the creditors get paid. These are their friends in Wall Street and in the hedge funds. So I don't see what legislation Eric is referring to. I find this repugnant, Eric, essentially coming from an organization that has distinguished itself for being an advocate for the poor around the world. And colonialism is repugnant in all of its forms and manifestations. You, my friend, will have blood in your hands if this results in the kind of unrest that we witnessed in the 1970s, because I will tell you with very certainty that people in Puerto Rico, once they discover the serious implications of this, will not tolerate it. And this imposes only harsher austerity measures on the Puerto Rican people of the situation that is already very bad. This is, in fact, a classic case study in what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine. The economic hitmen started operating in Puerto Rico from the vulture funds since the moment that Puerto Rico inexplicably was removed from bankruptcy protection in 1984. And then the governments kept borrowing. Puerto Rico had no tools for economic development. This bill contains no measures to restore economic growth and development, none whatsoever. Yet, Senator Sanders offered a legislation that addressed the question of economic growth and economic development, something similar to what FDR did in the 1940s with Eleanor Roosevelt and Rex Tocqueville's support that created a Puerto Rico Economic Reconstruction Administration. Nothing of that sort exists in this legislation. It's all about austerity, harsh austerity measures that will affect the most vulnerable in Puerto Rico.
Eric LeCompte?
When you read the legislation, you realize that there are some amazing and powerful anti-austerity measures that have been placed in the legislation. including what we have been able to amend to the legislation so that any economic growth plan, any recommendations must take into account reducing child poverty on the island. This is incredibly important. Also with the legislation, we were able to protect the work of the Debt Audit Committee. That's led by labor partners on the island, the Chamber of Commerce, but to find out where the debt comes from, what are the questions about the debt, is the debt legitimate or not, that's going to go forward because of this legislation. We have to understand that's really important. I think one of the great concerns that the religious leaders have had on the island, and we've certainly expressed in every debt restructuring plan we've worked on around the world for the last 20 years, is that going forward, there needs to be greater public budget transparency. The Debt Audit Commission is key to this. But we also agree that the Oversight Board is not the actual answer for this. There's no way to talk about the Oversight Board in Puerto Rico without talking about Puerto Rico's colonial status. And that's also true. The religious leaders acknowledge that reality and are very saddened by that. But they knew that going forward, passing this legislation in order to get votes on both sides of the aisle had to do this. Now, with acknowledging the Oversight Commission's status and the issues of colonialism on the island, I think it's really important to understand what the legislation actually says about the Oversight Commission. Even though we don't believe it's an efficient way to install public budget transparency, this is not like the control board we had in D.C., in New York, or we still have in Detroit. This particular Oversight Commission is an addition to the political process. It doesn't circumvent the governor. It doesn't circumvent the legislative process. It does add an additional approval and monitoring process to the budget. But with that said, I mean, we very much understand the concerns about any kind of oversight commission. That's why we've supported the public budget transparency initiatives of the debt audit. It's why we believe there needs to be legislation that passes in the legislature in Puerto Rico to have a higher degree of accountability. But I think most importantly, what we really need to understand is that these are some of the best and most powerful debt restructuring tools we've ever seen passed by the U.S. Congress. In fact, some of the provisions, whether negotiations are done in a voluntary way or whether they're forced, this is even better than Chapter 9 or Chapter 11 in the United States because it forces all sides of the problem to come together for negotiation and to come with a negotiated solution. It also forces any vulture funds that may exist not to be at the table because 3/4 of all creditors, when they agree to a solution, it binds all the creditors. So
but Eric, if I can interrupt you for a second. When you talk about the voluntary negotiations, these are voluntary negotiations not between the people of Puerto Rico and the bondholders. These are voluntary negotiations between the control board, 6 of whose 7 people don't even have to live in Puerto Rico, and the bondholders. So these are voluntary negotiations between 2 entities that are not part of the Puerto Rican nation. Or I mean, is it so?
No, that's not how the legislation actually reads. I mean, just to clarify and certainly understand what you're saying, but in terms of how the legislation actually operates, when we talk about voluntary negotiations, that's between the government of Puerto Rico and that's the creditors. Now, if a voluntary negotiation happens, and this is incredibly significant because all the bondholders are going to be forced into these negotiations, a final plan does need to be approved by the control board, but they're not the ones that are actually negotiating it. The legislation in its outset has strong protections for pensions, it has strong protections for social services, and it also notes that in any negotiation we can't see these types of services cut.
The entire labor movement, Eric, I don't know what planet you're living in, from the AFL-CIO, SEIU, ASME, the United Food and Commercial Workers, all of the unions here in the U.S. and in Puerto Rico rejected this. So I don't know what legislation you are referring to. All of the social advocacy organizations, except your friend, the bishop, the one that terminated the pensions for the school employees, accepted this. And I want you to understand something very clearly. you, my friend, will be held accountable to the Puerto Rican people. And I can say that no Puerto Rican that agrees to serve on this board ought to feel safe. I can say that because the rage that the Puerto Rican people will express as they discover the consequences of this legislation is such that you have no idea of what this would turn into. And I tell you one thing. I find that repugnant that Jubilee USA, which is an organization associated with a pope that we admire because of its defense of the poor and working families, has taken this position in what is now the Greece of the United States. This is the Greece of the United States. And you now are responsible as much as any of your friends that supported this legislation. I am really, really sorry that your organization endorsed this thing, Eric. Really sorry.
How do you account for Congress members Nydia Velázquez and José Serrano, who are both Puerto Rican-born? How do you account for their support for this?
I tell you, Luis Gutierrez was adamantly opposed to this because it has no safeguards for pensions, no protections for pensions whatsoever. I don't know what law Eric is reading here. That's why the entire labor movement rejected this thing. And Luis Gutierrez was very emphatic. This is repugnant because it's colonialism. It's raw and crude colonialism. And when you speak of colonialism in this day and age, this is an invitation. This is an invitation for people to take any measures, to get rid of colonialism. And so I think that Nydia and José Serrano will have to answer to the Puerto Rican people in due time. I believe they are good people. They have been consistent supporters of democratic rights, but on this one, they got it wrong. This junta, which is nothing than a colonial junta, usurp fundamental democratic rights of the Puerto Rican people, and this is very perverse.
Well, let me interrupt. I want to ask Eric about one of the aspects of the legislation, which has to do with the critical infrastructure portion, which I don't understand why it was even in the legislation to begin with, but it basically allows, especially with the electric company, which I've always called the crown jewels of Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico Electric and Power Authority, a government-owned electric company. It seems to pave the way for the privatization and the selling off of the assets of the electric company in an effort to modernize and bring in new investments. And it also, the legislation, as Senator Menendez said, allows all kinds of existing environmental laws and regulations to be waived in the process of expediting the modernization of the electric power generation in Puerto Rico. Do you have any concerns about that aspect of the legislation?
Well, we certainly have concerns that are related. With respect to Senator Menendez, we believe that he was, in his floor debate, actually referring to a much earlier version of the legislation where it talked about selling off portions of the Vieques Wildlife Refuge. It was one of the many provisions that we were successful in getting removed in this particular legislation. I think, some of the greater issues overall around this, it does have to do with implementation and how the Oversight Commission moves forward. We do have very specific concerns about the legislation, where we respectfully disagree with Jose that the pensions are respected, number one, to be paid back. And the pensions also have very strong language to protect them in the legislation. Our biggest concerns about the legislation remains that the new overtime protections could be delayed in Puerto Rico. And we do have certain concerns about certain powers that the Oversight Commission has. I mean, with that said, I think what we do understand from this legislation that right away this has stopped Puerto Rico from becoming the next Argentina. We've stopped vulture funds. We've essentially created a precedent where we say debt is paid first. We've stopped 16 lawsuits against the government of Puerto Rico, and we've made sure that vulture funds aren't coming to the table and that teachers, firefighters, and social services are paid first.
We're going to have to leave it there, but of course we'll continue to follow this. I want to thank Eric LeCompte, Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network in Washington, and Jose La Luz, labor activist, organizes, promotes, and advocates for worker rights in Puerto Rico and here overall in the United States. This